My name is Miller Files, and I have spent most of my life asking questions that people are afraid to hear the answers to. The truth is rarely comforting. It is rarely clean, and in some cases, like the one I am about to tell you, the truth is soaked not in metaphorical darkness, but in the cold waters of a river that runs quietly through the outskirts of Seattle. Green River, a place that would become a landmark of dread in American criminal history, not because of its natural beauty, but because of the secrets it refused to keep buried. When I look back at the early 80s, I imagine a city that didn't know it was being stalked. People lived their lives along streets lit by neon signs, through motels, diners, and industrial yards. No one suspected that beneath the routine hum of life, someone was hunting, someone who understood invisibility better than most magicians, someone who looked so ordinary that the world never thought twice when he passed by. For years, the city walked next to the monster without realizing it. The case officially began in the summer of 1982, a season when days were long, nights were warm, and Seattle seemed almost peaceful. But peace can be a disguise. And on a morning in July, when a young boy spotted what he first thought was a mannequin floating along the Green River, that disguise was ripped away. There is something uniquely horrifying about the discovery of a body in water. Water changes the way the skin looks. It changes the weight. It takes away identity. When investigators pulled the body to the shore, the silence of the river hung over the scene like a warning. This was not going to be an isolated tragedy. This was a beginning. As investigators, we are not allowed to rely on gut instinct alone, but sometimes instinct whispers before evidence speaks. And what we felt that morning was a disturbance too deep to ignore. Over the next weeks, more bodies appeared in or near the river, each discovery deepening the sense that a pattern was forming. Patterns are the language of killers, and the Green River Killer, though we did not yet know his name, was already speaking loudly. The victims had similarities that were too precise to dismiss. They were young women, many living on the margins of society. Some were runaways, some were sex workers. Some had struggled with addiction or unstable homes. Their lives, already fragile, made them easier targets. And that is something society does not like to admit. Vulnerability is not just misfortune. It is opportunity, at least through the eyes of a predator. What disturbed me most in those early months was not just the number of disappearances, but how quietly they occurred. When someone society considers respectable vanishes, alarms ring immediately. But when a girl with no permanent address or a girl surviving night to night in dangerous neighborhoods disappears, the alarm is softer. Sometimes it doesn't ring at all, and that silence is where monsters build their nests. I remember sitting in a briefing room filled with maps, case files, and photographs. We drew lines, circled locations, traced movements. We tried to find logic in chaos, but the river kept giving us more than we could process, as if mocking our attempt to control the narrative. Every new discovery felt like a message. The message was simple: I am ahead of you. To understand this killer, I had to understand his geography. Crime is never random. It bends to familiarity, and soon we realized there were two distinct zones in this case. The pickup zone, where he approached his victims, usually along the Pacific Highway South Corridor, a stretch known for poverty, sex work, and transient populations. And the dump zone, where he left them, often in wooded areas, ravines, or near the river. These zones told us something vital. He was comfortable. He knew the roads. He knew the shortcuts. He knew where headlights were rare and where no one walked after dark. This was his hunting ground, long before we knew his name. When a killer chooses an area repeatedly, he reveals more than he intends. He reveals routine, and routine is the closest thing investigators have to a compass. But despite our growing understanding, the investigation was slipping into a fog of uncertainty. For every lead that appeared promising, two more dissolved. Witnesses were afraid to speak or did not remember clearly. Some did not trust law enforcement. Some had reasons not to. Others simply moved away, drifting from city to city, the way their lives had always forced them to. What made this case profoundly difficult in the early years was the lack of technological tools we now take for granted. DNA testing existed only in primitive form. Databases were smaller, slower, and poorly connected across jurisdictions. Evidence that might crack a case today was then little more than guesswork. Standing on the riverbank, looking at the drag marks in the mud and the tire impressions half washed away by the tide, I understood that this killer operated with terrifying efficiency. He separated scenes of abduction from scenes of disposal, fragmenting the investigation into pieces scattered across a county. It was like chasing a ghost who knew the terrain better than we knew the map. In those months, the fear in the community changed shape. At first, it was shock, then anxiety, then, gradually, a quiet resignation. The human mind can get used to anything, even terror, if exposed long enough. And that, perhaps, is the most dangerous adaptation a society can make, because the moment fear becomes background noise, a killer gains power. But the river did not forget. Nature remembers what people overlook, and little by little, it gave us clues, small ones, fragile ones, but clues that would someday converge into a truth too strong to deny. This case, this nightmare, would stretch far beyond what any of us imagined, and in time, it would test not only the limits of forensic science, but the limits of our moral responsibility toward the forgotten. That was the beginning, and the beginning was enough to change my life forever. There is a particular moment in every long investigation when the atmosphere of a city begins to shift. It happens slowly, almost imperceptibly, like a shadow crawling across the ground as the sun sets. In the early months of the Green River investigation, I felt that shift. Seattle was no longer simply a city with a series of crimes. It had become a city that sensed it was being hunted. Fear does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it seeps in through the cracks of everyday life. A woman walking alone at night crosses the street earlier than she used to. A motel clerk watches guests more closely. Mothers tell their daughters not to take certain buses or not to walk past certain intersections. Even the police radios begin to sound different, filled not with urgency, but with a quiet, persistent desperation. It was as if everyone sensed that something unseen was moving around them, choosing victims with a logic only it understood. For me, the turning point came when the number of missing young women no longer resembled coincidence. The early files showed names, faces, ages, last known locations. Many of the reports were sparse, missing details that could have helped us. Some victims had no stable home address. Some had no recent contact with family. Some had not been reported missing for days or even weeks. They had slipped through the cracks of a system that had not yet realized how much danger they were in. And once they fell into the river's silence, the river did not give them back easily. The investigation expanded rapidly. The task force that formed around the case worked under conditions that felt increasingly chaotic. I remember walking into the command center and seeing a wall covered in photographs. Every few days, another face was added. The faces blurred together after a while, but their stories did not. Each of them had lived a life that mattered, even if society had not always treated them that way. That was one of the hardest truths to swallow. We were not simply fighting a killer. We were fighting the collective blindness that made his work easier. As the number of victims rose, so did the theories. Some investigators believed we were dealing with multiple offenders. Others suspected a transient drifter, someone with no roots and no pattern. A few thought the killer might be someone hiding behind an authoritative role, someone who used trust as a weapon, and some, quietly, whispered the possibility that the killer was someone with a clean facade, a man who blended into the background so effortlessly that no one would ever suspect him. The uncertainty created a storm of false leads. Rumors spread faster than evidence could counter them. We chased down confessions from attention seekers, tips from psychics who claimed visions of the killer's face, and accusations fueled by personal grudges. None of it brought us closer to the truth. Every wasted hour felt like a debt we owed to the victims. What we needed was not noise. We needed patterns, and slowly patterns emerged. One night, I sat alone in the briefing room long after everyone else had gone home. I stared at the map of King County, the red markers that indicated where bodies had been found, and the yellow pins showing last known locations of missing women. They formed two shapes, two clusters that echoed each other. One cluster hugged the Pacific Highway South Corridor. The other hugged the wilderness. When I connected the markers with a pencil, it looked like a trail followed by someone who knew the land intimately. This realization changed the investigation for me. It wasn't simply about victims who happened to live in dangerous areas. It was about someone choosing those areas because they understood how to disappear within them. The killer was not improvising. He was repeating a script, and repetition meant comfort. Comfort meant routine. Routine meant he was not a drifter. He was someone who lived here, someone whose daily life intersected with these roads, these forests, these riverbanks. Around this time, the media pressure intensified. Reporters camped outside police headquarters. Microphones were shoved into the faces of investigators. The public demanded answers, demanded arrests, demanded certainty in a situation defined by the absence of certainty. Every briefing felt like walking on a wire above a storm. Say too little, and the public panicked. Say too much, and the killer could adjust his tactics. I learned to choose my words carefully. A single misplaced sentence could ignite fear or mislead the public. The city was no longer just a backdrop. It was a living organism, reacting to every discovery, every rumor, every hint of progress or failure. Yet beneath the public pressure, something more corrosive was affecting the investigation: internal exhaustion. Detectives worked endless shifts. Some went home only to sleep for 2 hours before returning. Others stopped going home altogether, living instead in the stale fluorescent glow of the command center. The emotional weight of the case was enormous. Looking at the faces of the victims each day made it impossible not to feel the growing sense of responsibility. The guilt of not stopping the killer sooner, the frustration of not seeing the next move clearly. Despite everything, the killer continued. The river and the surrounding woods continued to reveal more victims. Each body found was a wound reopened, a reminder that the investigation was always trailing behind someone who knew the terrain too well. There was a moment late one evening when I stood alone at one of the dump sites. The sky was a dull gray, the kind of color that absorbs sound and makes the world feel unnervingly still. I looked at the narrow path through the trees, the way it curved slightly and disappeared into darkness. Someone had walked that path carrying the lifeless body of a young woman, someone who felt no fear, no hesitation, no need to rush, someone who believed confidently that he would not be caught. That confidence was what frightened me most. A killer becomes bold when he believes the environment protects him, and in these early years, the environment did. The killer had a system, and we were still learning its rules. But the river does not protect forever. Nature forgets nothing, and every path walked repeatedly leaves traces. The question was how long it would take before those traces became visible enough for us to follow. There comes a point in every long pursuit when the hunter must stop and ask himself a difficult question. What if the one being hunted knows the terrain better than I ever will? During the third phase of the Green River investigation, that question became impossible to ignore. We were hunting someone who moved through the landscape as if he were made from it, someone who blended into the roads, the highways, the dirt paths, the riverbanks, the spaces between light and darkness, someone who learned from our movements, even as we struggled to learn from his. The first thing that struck me during this period was how the killer's confidence seemed to grow. He did not speak to us, not directly, but every dump site was a message. Some bodies were hidden deep inside thick brush, placed in ways that suggested meticulous control. Others were left in more accessible areas as if he wanted to test us, to see how long it would take before they were found. Each discovery felt like he was speaking in a language without words, telling us that he understood the rhythm of our investigation and could adjust his own rhythm to stay ahead. There is a psychological complexity in this kind of predator. Many people imagine serial killers as chaotic, unhinged individuals driven purely by impulse. But the Green River Killer was nothing like that. His work showed discipline. He understood timing. He knew when to strike and when to disappear. He knew which victims would be noticed quickly and which ones would drift through the cracks unnoticed. This balance between precision and invisibility is what made him so dangerous. Around this time, I found myself returning repeatedly to the river, not always for evidence, sometimes simply to understand. The river had become a silent witness, carrying the weight of each victim in its cold currents. I stood at its edge many nights, listening to the water move and wondering how many times he had stood in that exact place. Did he pause the way I paused? Did he listen to the same silence? Did he feel invisible there, hidden beneath the vastness of the land? One evening, while surveying a site with the forensics team, I noticed something small that others had overlooked, a faint impression in the soil, not from a shoe, but from a knee. It suggested someone had knelt down. The print was too degraded for identification, but its presence told a story. Predators are often imagined as towering, unstoppable forces, but here was a moment of vulnerability, a moment where he had been on the ground, close to the earth, close to the victim. That kneeling mark, erased almost completely by the wind and time, reminded me that even ghosts leave shadows. During this stage of the investigation, the task force underwent significant reorganizing. We were overwhelmed, evidence rooms overflowed, interviews stacked up faster than we could process them. Tips came in by the hundreds. We needed structure, we needed clarity. And so, a rotation system was introduced. Fresh investigators were cycled in to relieve those who were burning out. Analysts created new methods of cross-referencing missing person reports with unidentified remains. Profilers constructed complex psychological maps that tried to predict the killer's moves. But even with these improvements, the killer stayed ahead. There was a night I will never forget. It was raining steadily, the kind of rain that turns highways into mirrors of broken light. A call came in that a body had been found near a wooded area south of the city. I drove there alone, arriving before most of the team. The forest smelled of wet soil and cedar. Mist curled around the trees like drifting smoke. When I found the site, I stopped moving. It wasn't the body itself that froze me, but the positioning. Her body had been placed with a care that felt almost ceremonial. It was as if he had arranged her gently, almost respectfully, a disturbing contradiction to the brutality of the act. Standing there, I realized something important. He didn't just kill, he curated the aftermath. He shaped the narrative. The placement of the bodies wasn't random. It was expressive. It told us that he felt ownership over the victims even after death. This sense of ownership is a psychological hallmark of organized offenders. It also means something more troubling. He believed he would never lose control. As weeks turned into months, I began to sense a pattern in his behavior. After each discovery, there was a lull. Not a disappearance, but a settling. It was as if he stepped back, observing how we reacted, studying our movements. Predators of this kind are highly attuned to feedback. If we increased patrols, he shifted locations. If we spoke to the media, he changed his habits. If we formed new strategies, he adapted before we could fully implement them. It was like playing chess against someone who could see the board from above. One night, after reviewing files until my eyes burned, I closed the folders and simply sat in silence. I tried to imagine him, not the face, we didn't know it yet, but the presence, the way he might breathe, the way he might drive at night, the way he might approach a victim, not with rage, but with the calm efficiency of someone performing a routine task. It was a chilling thought that murder had become routine for him. This was the period where I began to understand something essential. The killer's greatest advantage wasn't his cunning. It wasn't his physical strength. It wasn't even the remoteness of the dump sites. His greatest advantage was society's indifference toward the victims he chose. Their disappearances did not shake the city. Their absence did not mobilize immediate search efforts. They were already living on the margins, invisible to the wider world, and the killer understood this just as clearly as we did. That truth weighed on me heavier than any piece of evidence. It meant that catching him wasn't only about solving a case. It was about confronting a collective failure, the kind of failure that allows predators to flourish in plain sight. There is a limit to what intuition can solve, a limit to how far maps, interviews, and late tea-night speculation can take you. In every long investigation, there comes a moment when human reasoning reaches the edge of its usefulness. For us, that edge arrived in the early 90s, when the weight of the Green River case felt almost unbearable. We had mountains of files, hundreds of interviews, aerial photographs, soil samples, psychological profiles, autopsy reports. But what we did not have was a bridge that connected suspicion to proof. In those years, the killer's identity remained concealed behind a curtain that no amount of experience or instinct could pull open. And then science began to whisper. It started softly, like a distant hum. New forensic methods were emerging across the country. Labs were experimenting with techniques that promised something remarkable: the ability to identify an individual from biological traces invisible to the naked eye. This technology had a name that would later reshape the entire landscape of criminal justice: DNA. In the early years of the Green River Task Force, DNA analysis was nothing more than a rumor of possibility. The technology was crude, imprecise compared to today. It required far more sample material than most crime scenes provided. The processing time was painfully slow, but even in its infancy, DNA carried the weight of a miracle. For the first time, the human body itself could become a witness. The more we learned about the technology, the more I realized something painful. We had collected evidence from victims years ago, samples we had stored carefully, even though we didn't know how to use them yet. The Green River Killer had left behind traces too small, too fragile, too degraded for the tools of the 80s. But now, those tools were evolving. I remember sitting with the forensic lead in a cramped lab lit by humming fluorescent lights. She explained that some of the samples had survived surprisingly well. Biological material had been preserved just enough to attempt testing. The idea that we might extract a truth from something collected a decade earlier felt almost impossible, but impossibility had never stopped science. Around this time, the task force shrank, public attention drifted, other crimes surged. New priorities emerged, budgets tightened. Many believed the Green River case had gone cold forever. There were whispers that the killer was dead, imprisoned for another crime, or simply too careful to ever be caught. The case boxes gathered dust, but some of us refused to let go. I spent many nights alone in the evidence room, reading files by the weak glow of a single desk lamp. Each page felt like a small heartbeat beneath my fingers. I knew these names too well. I had memorized their faces, their ages, the last places they were seen alive. I owed them more than a shrug and a sigh of defeat. And so I kept returning, hoping that somewhere in the thousands of pages, something would align with the new tools science had given us. The turning point arrived quietly, without fanfare. A set of biological samples was sent for advanced DNA testing. There was no guarantee. We had learned not to expect miracles. But the lab technicians treated the evidence with a reverence that bordered on spiritual. They knew the history of the case. They knew what was at stake. Weeks passed. Then a phone call came. The voice on the other end sounded steady, but I could hear something trembling beneath the surface. The tests had produced a profile, not a partial pattern, not a contaminated signature, a complete, admissible DNA profile. For the first time in nearly 20 years of investigation, the killer had left a fingerprint that could not be erased. I felt a strange stillness settle over me. It wasn't excitement, it wasn't relief. It was something quieter, something heavier. The sense that the case had shifted irrevocably, that we were stepping from darkness into a place where the truth could no longer hide. The next step was the longest breath of my career. We ran the DNA against the existing databases. Days passed. Then a match appeared. A man whose name had surfaced before, briefly, years earlier, only to fade into the vast noise of suspects. A man who had once passed a polygraph. A man interviewed lightly, casually, almost as a formality. A man who had lived his life quietly, married, employed, ordinary Gary Ridgway. The match was not a theory. It was not a hunch. It was not the product of late tea-night speculation. It was science speaking with absolute certainty. A memory surfaced in my mind, a younger version of myself flipping through a list of early suspects. Ridgway was just a name back then, one of many. His interview seemed uneventful, his demeanor unremarkable. He had moved through our screens like a ghost disguised as a neighbor. Now that ghost had a fingerprint. When we finally moved to arrest him in 2001, the moment felt surreal. Ridgway reacted with the calm confusion of a man being inconvenienced. Not confronted with decades of murder, his face showed no panic, no guilt, no resistance. It was the neutrality of someone who had rehearsed this moment in his mind and decided long ago that emotion was unnecessary. In the interrogation room, his composure was almost unnatural. He answered questions lightly, carefully, as if choosing words from a pre-written script. But every time I looked at him, I felt a strange disconnect. This man, sitting across from me, looked smaller than the monster who had haunted an entire region. His eyes lacked fire. His posture lacked menace. He was ordinary to the point of horror. The river had hidden him well. As the evidence mounted and the truth closed in, the reality of what DNA had given us became clear. Science had done what instinct, experience, and manpower had failed to do. It had turned the invisible into the undeniable. But victory in investigations like this is never clean. It comes with revelations, heavy enough to crush anyone who carries them. Ridgway did not simply confess to a few crimes. He admitted to many, more than most investigators could emotionally process in one sitting. The scale of his violence forced us to confront a new truth. This was not just a serial killer. This was a man who had exploited every weakness in the system, every blind spot in society, every moment of vulnerability in his victims. When the truth finally arrives in a long investigation, it rarely comes with triumph. It comes with weight, a kind of heaviness that sits on the chest and reminds you that every answered question was paid for with someone's life. The arrest of Gary Ridgway in 2001 should have felt like victory. After decades of hunting a ghost, the ghost finally had a face. But instead of celebration, what I felt was a deep, unsettling quiet, because catching the killer was not the end. It was only the beginning of understanding the scale of what he had done. After the DNA match tied him irrevocably to multiple victims, the interrogation room became a place where the silence felt sharper than any confession. Ridgway sat across from us, relaxed, almost relieved. It was as if decades of secrets had weighed on him, and now that the truth cornered him, he no longer felt the need to hide. His voice was steady, his eyes unremarkable, his demeanor calm. He spoke about the murders, not with rage or excitement, but with the flat tone of a man recounting errands. His lack of emotion was the most chilling part. When he began to confess, the room felt smaller. He spoke about picking up victims, about driving to secluded areas, about choosing locations like he was describing routine stops on a familiar route. He spoke about the river with unsettling familiarity, as if it were a partner rather than a witness. And as his words piled up, one confession after another, the scale of the darkness he had created began to stretch far beyond what any of us imagined. There is a moment in every investigator's life when he realizes the truth is larger than the case file. Ridgway admitted to killing dozens of women, a number so large it blurred the line between statistic and tragedy. While he would eventually plead guilty to 48 murders, the real total may never be known. Some victims were never found. Some disappeared before anyone could record their names. For every name we had, there was likely another shadow we would never identify. In the months that followed his arrest, something unusual happened. The investigation did not slow down. It accelerated. Ridgway agreed to a plea deal that required him to cooperate fully in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. Many people felt anger at that decision. They wanted the harshest punishment imaginable. But for us, there was one priority: bringing closure to families who had waited decades for answers. If Ridgway's cooperation meant we could recover remains or finally identify victims, then the painful compromise became necessary. The interviews that followed were some of the most emotionally complex moments of my career. We drove Ridgway across the county, revisiting places where he had left victims. He remembered most of them with disturbing clarity. At some sites he stood quietly, pointing to a patch of earth or a cluster of trees. At others he struggled, his memory tangled by time. But even in those moments, he showed a cold practicality, as if he were walking through a garden he tended long ago. Standing beside him during these field visits created a strange dissonance. The man who had inflicted unimaginable suffering looked like someone you might pass in a supermarket aisle. Small, soft-spoken, forgettable. And that was the horror. He had hidden in the open because he knew society rarely looks closely at people. It assumes are ordinary. As the investigation continued, remains were recovered. Some victims were identified for the first time. Others finally had confirmation for families who had waited more than half their lives to hear what had happened. I saw mothers clutch photographs with trembling hands, fathers staring at the ground as if trying to absorb news that their minds could not bear. Some cried, some became silent, some thanked us, some could not look at us. All of them had lost something that could never be restored. What stayed with me most was not Ridgway's confessions. It was the faces of those families. They had lived in limbo for 20 years, trapped between hope and despair. For them, closure did not mean healing. It simply meant knowing which direction to grieve. When Ridgway finally entered his guilty plea in 2003, the courtroom was full. Rows of families filled the benches. Reporters scribbled notes. The air felt thick with grief and anger. When Ridgway spoke, his voice was soft and almost mechanical. He apologized, but the apology carried no life, no sincerity. It was merely another procedure. He received multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. The door closed behind him, and for the first time in decades, the city breathed a little easier. Not because the pain was gone, but because the threat had finally been contained. In the years that followed, something remarkable happened. Advances in forensic genetic genealogy allowed investigators to identify victims who had once seemed lost forever. Even recently, names once listed as Jane Doe were finally reunited with their stories. It is a reminder that science continues to speak long after the killer is gone from the world. Looking back now, I understand something I did not fully grasp then. The Green River case was never just about catching a murderer. It was about confronting the systems that allowed him to thrive. The indifference toward vulnerable women, the underfunding of missing person investigations, the assumptions that certain lives mattered less. Ridgway did not create those weaknesses. He exploited them. And that is the final truth of the case. The river had carried the bodies of his victims, but society had carried the conditions that made the crimes possible. As I stand here at the end of this long memory, I return once more to the river. Its surface moves gently, as if erasing the past. But beneath the water is a history that cannot be washed away. The river remembers. And so do I.